So, what exactly is emotional regulation? Following self awareness, emotional self regulation is popularly known as the second step in gaining emotional intelligence. But what exactly does it mean? Let's start by going over what emotional self regulation is not. Regulation of your emotion is not about being unemotional, it's not about suppressing emotion. It's not about being super analytical or cerebral about everything. And lastly, regulation is not about gritting your teeth, white knuckling stressful situations, or avoiding emotion altogether. Emotion is an essential aspect of being human. It's the management of our emotion and its associated relevance to our current life that we need to improve. Now, imagine if our emotions were like the spices and flavorings we use to enhance any food recipe. Take red pepper as example. We don't just dump red pepper into every dish and throw it in a cup at a time, right? Yuck. Red pepper is not something that's appropriate for or relevant to every dish. And our emotional system, dumping a big surge of adrenaline into every unexpected life situation, isn't appealing or productive either. Similar to red pepper, adrenaline, or even dopamine is not appropriate or relevant to every life situation either. So we need to train our brains to activate the right amount of emotional response for each current life situation, train it to consider alternative perspectives, and train it to think more flexibly. That's the recipe for having the most helpful and enjoyable interactions with other humans on a daily basis. So let's take a look at how the human emotional response system is designed to work. When we're born, our stress response or emotional response system is not fully developed or calibrated yet. Our stress response system requires critical thinking, discernment, and judgment capabilities in order to fully develop. Those brain skills are what help us determine which experiences are truly life-threatening and which ones are merely uncomfortable or unpleasant. The part of the brain that handles critical thinking and judgment remains underdeveloped for 7 or 8 years. So, a younger child relies on the parent's critical thinking, discernment, and judgment capability to help understand, manage, regulate, or fine tune their emotional experiences. A parent does this with a baby through connection, modeling, discomfort alleviation, and soothing. In other words, the parent is supplementing the baby's part of the brain that hasn't fully developed yet with their own brain that has fully developed. They are creating the child's emotional recipe together. Now, depending on how quickly and routinely the caregiver can soothe the child back to a neutral, calm state, the child's emotional response system starts to learn to rebound itself back from an uncomfortable, fearful, or anxious emotional state to a calmer, more comfortable, and neutral emotional state. And it does so in a relatively short period of time. In other words, the emotional response system starts to develop a workable range, learning how and when to turn on and off, and when it does turn on, how much is needed. When this is repeated, an emotional working range centered around neutral calm becomes our default or the automatic emotional home base for most of our day-to-day life experiences. As the child grows older, the parent can then teach the child to do this for him or herself. They can teach the child how to pay attention to his or her own emotions and their own body sensations. They can teach them to identify and create his or her own feelings and choose diverse and helpful ways to soothe themselves back to their calmer, more moderate emotional default range. In other words, as the child's critical thinking brain develops, the parent teaches the child to use his or her own brain to self-regulate, self-soothe, and self-center themselves emotionally. And eventually the parent no longer has to supplement the child's brain with their own brain. Now, did any of you get that kind of coaching growing up? I sure didn't, at least not consistently or as comprehensively as I just described. We just didn't have the knowledge back then that we do now. Most psychological theory on parent-child attachment has only been scientifically understood in the last 20 years or so. So parents back then were operating out of the current knowledge of the time and a lot of mixed theory. And many of our parents may have unknowingly had unregulated emotional response systems themselves. So if the child isn't soothed back to their neutral, calm range consistently or fast enough, the child's emotional response system can spend too much time in intense emotion. It can spend too much time in either high arousal or too much time in low arousal. They can spend too much time in fear or too much time in sadness before returning to a more neutral state of calm. If these prolonged states of intense emotion are repeated, or the child isn't modeled or taught how to healthily come off those intense emotions, the stress response system remains unmanaged and the child's ability to tolerate stress remains low. In other words, the child's system never learns to quickly rebound back to neutral calm. And so it gradually accepts the high arousal or low arousal emotional state as its new normal default range for everyday life. Now, what I want you to understand is that there's nothing wrong with the emotional response in itself. The brain is simply doing what it's designed to do. But the when, how much, and how long aspects of the emotional response don't get differentiated. In other words, the brain doesn't learn to tell the difference between when certain emotions are appropriate and when they're not. And so intense, prolonged, or frequent emotional response remains linked to situations that are not always life-threatening. Said as a summary, the strength and style of relationship between a child and its parent, or what's referred to as attachment style, that relationship combined with how well the child learns to manage his or her own emotional experience will determine the functional range of stress tolerance that the child grows up with. One of my favorite researchers weighs in on the subject of emotional regulation in this way. Neuropsychologist Dr. Alan Shore describes the two components of emotional regulation as interactive regulation and autoregulation. This is the ability to flexibly manage our emotional states, both interactively with other people and through autoregulation on our own. In other words, true emotional management is a skill with two parts: the ability to manage your emotional responses while interacting with other people, as well as the ability to manage your emotions when you're by yourself. So, why is this capability to quickly regulate, differentiate, or manage our emotional response so critical? Because number one, as a species, humans are dependent on biological synchronicity in order to survive. In other words, as much as we idealize complete independence and limitless freedom, humans have to learn to get along, interact, and become interdependent with each other in semi-harmonious ways, or our species will eventually die off. In other words, in part, it's a natural necessity. And second, I believe that a nervous system that's dysregulated makes it harder for a person to see that they are enough, they have enough, and they're doing enough. The uncomfortable sensation of frequently activated adrenaline can often be misinterpreted as dissatisfaction, constantly cueing us to search for more, do more, and have more in a non-ending attempt to get rid of it. And this constant quest for the relief of this adrenaline is part of what's actually perpetuating it, which we'll discuss in more detail when we learn about feedback loops.